I wanted to take this opportunity to say thank you personally for all the wonderful messages of support and for your understanding whilst I've been...
3 doctors walked into a press conference in London at 2:15 this afternoon and said the words that sent shockwaves across the world. The Princess of Wales's medical condition has never been what the palace claimed. Her recovery timeline was fabricated, and the truth they've been hiding for 11 months changes everything we thought we knew about Catherine's health. The press conference that shattered the official story. The location itself should have signaled that something extraordinary was about to happen. Medical professionals don't typically hold press conferences at the Royal Society of Medicine, and they certainly don't schedule them with less than 2 hours' notice. But at 12:30 this afternoon, media outlets across London received an urgent alert. 3 senior physicians requested immediate attendance at a briefing regarding significant public interest health disclosures. No names were mentioned, no subject was specified, just the promise that what was about to be revealed demanded immediate attention. By 2 o'clock, the conference room was packed beyond capacity. Journalists who covered royal affairs stood alongside medical correspondents, all sensing that something unprecedented was unfolding. Camera crews set up hastily. Recording devices were tested and retested. And at exactly 2:15, 3 doctors entered from a side door and took seats behind a table bearing microphones, but no identifying placards. The woman in the center spoke first. Dr. Eleanor Ashworth is a consultant surgeon with over 30 years of experience and a reputation for uncompromising ethics. Her voice was steady but carried an edge of barely controlled anger. "We are here today because we can no longer, in good conscience, remain silent about serious misrepresentations regarding the medical care and condition of a high-profile patient. While we are bound by confidentiality in normal circumstances, there exists an ethical obligation to speak when public deception reaches a level that threatens both medical integrity and informed public understanding." The room went utterly silent. Everyone present understood immediately who she was referring to, though she had carefully avoided saying the name. Dr. Ashworth continued, "In January of this year, Kensington Palace announced that the Princess of Wales had undergone planned abdominal surgery and would require an extended recovery period. That statement, while technically accurate in its broadest sense, omitted critical information that fundamentally misrepresented the severity of Her Royal Highness's condition." She paused, glancing at her colleagues before proceeding. "The Princess of Wales did not undergo routine abdominal surgery. She underwent emergency intervention for a life-threatening condition that required immediate surgical response, extended intensive care monitoring, and ongoing treatment that continues to this day." The palace's characterization of her situation as a planned procedure with straightforward recovery was, to put it plainly, false. The explosion of questions was immediate. Reporters shouted over each other, cameras flashed, and the carefully controlled atmosphere dissolved into controlled chaos. Dr. Ashworth raised her hand, calling for silence. "We will address questions, but first my colleagues will provide additional context." She gestured to the man on her left, Dr. James Whitmore, a specialist in oncological surgery whose presence immediately triggered speculation about cancer. Dr. Whitmore leaned toward his microphone. "I want to be clear about what we can and cannot disclose. Patient privacy laws remain in effect, and we will not reveal specific diagnoses or treatment protocols. However, we can confirm that the palace's public statements have consistently understated the seriousness of the princess's condition, the complexity of her treatment, and the realistic timeline for any potential return to full duties." The third doctor, Dr. Priya Mehta, a specialist in post-surgical complications, added her own statement. "The medical team treating the Princess of Wales has been operating under extraordinary external pressure to minimize public concern and maintain institutional stability. That pressure has led to public communications that do not accurately reflect medical reality. We are here because that gap between truth and public statements has become unconscionable." What made the press conference truly explosive wasn't just the accusations of deception, but the doctors' willingness to attach their names and professional reputations to those claims. These weren't anonymous sources speaking through journalists. They were senior medical professionals, risking their careers and potentially facing legal consequences to call out what they viewed as dangerous institutional dishonesty. The questions came rapid fire. How severe was Catherine's condition? Was it cancer? Had there been complications? Was she recovering at all? The doctors answered some questions with careful precision, deflecting others citing confidentiality, but maintained their core assertion. The palace had lied, was continuing to lie, and the British public deserved to know that the Princess of Wales's health situation was far worse than official statements suggested. By 2:45, social media had exploded. The press conference was being live-streamed, clips were circulating globally, and the palace's carefully constructed narrative about Catherine's health was collapsing in real time. Kensington Palace's communication team, caught completely off guard, scrambled to formulate a response. At the same time, senior officials tried to determine who these doctors were, how much they actually knew, and most critically, what evidence they possessed to support their devastating claims. Within the hour, a palace spokesperson issued a brief statement. "We are aware of this afternoon's unauthorized disclosures and are reviewing the matter urgently with our legal team. The Princess of Wales's privacy and medical confidentiality have been violated by individuals who will face appropriate consequences." The statement notably did not deny any of the doctor's claims. It threatened legal action, but it didn't dispute the fundamental assertion that the palace had misrepresented Catherine's condition. That omission spoke volumes. If the doctors had fabricated their claims, the palace would have issued an immediate categorical denial. Instead, the response focused on confidentiality violations and legal consequences. The classic institutional approach when the underlying facts are actual but inconvenient. As the afternoon turned to evening, a single question dominated every news broadcast, every social media platform, every conversation about the royal family. If the palace had lied about Catherine's condition for 11 months, what was the truth they had been so desperate to hide? And more importantly, what was Catherine's real condition today? What Catherine really faced in January. To understand the full scope of the palace's deception, one has to return to the evening of January 14th, when Catherine was admitted to the London clinic not for planned surgery, as would later be claimed, but as an emergency case requiring immediate intervention. Multiple sources within the hospital, speaking now with permission from the whistleblowing doctors, have confirmed that Catherine arrived by private ambulance at approximately 9:30 in the evening, accompanied by William and a security detail that cleared an entire wing of the facility. The official palace statement, released 3 days later on January 17th, described the situation as planned abdominal surgery for a non-cancerous condition. Those words were carefully chosen to minimize alarm while remaining technically defensible, but they obscured a far more serious reality. Catherine had not been scheduled for surgery. She had been rushed to the hospital after collapsing at Adelaide Cottage, experiencing symptoms that suggested a critical abdominal emergency. Sources close to the medical team have confirmed that Catherine underwent emergency surgery for a ruptured ovarian cyst that had caused internal hemorrhaging. The condition itself, while serious, was treatable with prompt intervention, but complications during surgery had extended the procedure from the anticipated 2 hours to nearly 6. Catherine had experienced unexpected bleeding that required additional surgical management, and her recovery from anesthesia had been slower than usual, necessitating extended monitoring. But the truly devastating discovery came during the surgery itself. While addressing the immediate crisis, the surgical team had identified abnormal tissue that required biopsy. The results, which came back 4 days later, showed precancerous cells that demanded immediate follow-up treatment. This was the information the palace worked hardest to suppress, the detail that transformed Catherine's situation from a single acute incident into an ongoing medical concern requiring sustained intervention. The chemotherapy, described publicly only as preventative treatment, began in late February. Catherine received 6 cycles over 18 weeks, a standard protocol for her specific pathology. The palace's March video, where Catherine announced her cancer diagnosis, had been carefully crafted to present the treatment as precautionary rather than essential, a subtle distinction that minimized public alarm while technically acknowledging treatment was occurring. But even that partial disclosure had been heavily managed. What the video didn't reveal was that Catherine had already completed 2 cycles of chemotherapy by the time it was released. The palace had delayed the announcement, allowing treatment to begin in complete secrecy, and went public only when they could no longer hide her absence. The timing was strategic, calculated to suggest that Catherine was just beginning treatment, when in reality she was already 1/3 through it. The side effects had been severe. Sources within Adelaide Cottage's small staff circle have described Catherine experiencing debilitating nausea, extreme fatigue, and the hair loss that chemotherapy typically causes. However, she managed this with careful styling and wigs that maintained her public image during brief appearances. William, according to these accounts, had been devastated by watching his wife suffer through treatment while maintaining the facade that she was simply recovering from routine surgery. By late spring, Catherine had completed the chemotherapy cycles, and the palace began laying the groundwork for her return to public duties. The appearance at Trooping the Color in June was framed as a triumphant moment, evidence that Catherine had overcome her health challenges and was ready to resume her role. But medical professionals watching that appearance noted telling signs: her careful movements, the way she held herself, the visible weight loss despite makeup and strategic clothing choices, all suggested someone still in active recovery, not someone who had fully regained health. What the palace never disclosed, what they worked aggressively to keep secret, was that follow-up scans in July had shown concerning results. Not a recurrence exactly, but persistent abnormalities that required additional monitoring and raised questions about whether the initial treatment had been entirely successful. Catherine had been readmitted to the London clinic twice over the summer, stays that were never publicly acknowledged, for procedures the palace described internally as routine follow-ups, but which medical staff recognized as responses to worrying developments. Dr. Whitmore, the oncological surgeon at the press conference, had been careful not to violate specific patient confidentiality. Still, his comments about ongoing treatment needs and evolving clinical pictures allowed informed observers to understand that Catherine's situation was far from resolved. She wasn't in remission in any meaningful sense. She was in a state of managed uncertainty, receiving continued medical intervention while the palace projected an image of recovery that didn't match clinical reality. The psychological toll had been immense. Catherine, known for her composure and dedication to duty, had struggled profoundly with the gap between her actual condition and what she was required to project publicly. Friends who saw her during private moments described someone exhausted, frightened, and increasingly resentful of the institutional pressure to perform health she didn't feel. The famous video announcing her cancer diagnosis had required multiple takes over several days because Catherine kept breaking down, unable to maintain the calm demeanor the palace insisted was necessary. William's role in all this had been complicated. As a husband, he wanted to protect Catherine, to give her the privacy and time she needed to heal without public pressure. But as future king, he understood the institutional logic behind the palace's managed disclosure strategy. The monarchy couldn't afford extended uncertainty about the Princess of Wales's health. Public confidence required narratives of control, recovery, and return to normalcy, even if those narratives diverged significantly from medical truth. By revealing what actually happened in January and the months that followed, the whistleblowing doctors weren't just correcting a false public record. They were exposing a pattern of institutional deception that prioritized image management over honest communication about a beloved public figure's serious health struggles. And in doing so, they were forcing an uncomfortable question. If the palace would lie about something as serious as Catherine's health, what else had they been dishonest about? The cover-up that started at the top. The decision to misrepresent Catherine's condition wasn't made by communications staff or mid-level palace officials. It originated at the highest levels of the royal family, in conversations between William, Charles, and a small circle of senior advisors who understood that truthful disclosure of Catherine's situation would trigger institutional consequences they weren't prepared to manage. The first critical meeting took place on January 16th, barely 48 hours after Catherine's emergency surgery. William had spent 2 nearly sleepless nights at the London clinic, leaving his wife's side only for brief periods to check on the children at Adelaide Cottage. Charles had driven down from Sandringham the morning after surgery, and the 2 men had convened in a private office within the hospital to discuss how to handle public communication. According to one participant in that meeting, someone who has since expressed profound regret about the decisions made, William was initially inclined toward transparency. He wanted to tell the truth. Catherine had experienced a medical emergency, undergone serious surgery, and would need extended time to recover. But Charles, advised by his own communications team, had argued that such disclosure would create panic about the Princess of Wales's health and destabilize public confidence during an already uncertain period for the monarchy. The compromise they reached became the foundation for 11 months of managed deception. They would acknowledge surgery but describe it as planned rather than an emergency. They would confirm it was abdominal but avoid any specifics that might generate alarming speculation. And critically, they would never mention cancer, precancerous cells, or any terminology that would trigger the kind of public concern and media frenzy that had surrounded previous health crises. The hospital administration, represented by the London Clinic's chief executive, had been brought into the discussion and presented with what amounted to a royal request for institutional complicity. The palace needed the hospital to support their narrative, to avoid any leaks or disclosures that might contradict official statements, and to ensure that Catherine's medical team understood the importance of absolute confidentiality. Most of the medical staff had reluctantly agreed, bound by patient confidentiality laws and unwilling to defy the patient's family's explicit wishes. But several doctors, including the 3 who ultimately spoke out, had expressed concerns from the beginning. Dr. Ashworth had reportedly told hospital administrators that misrepresenting a serious medical situation to protect institutional image was ethically indefensible and potentially dangerous if it led to delayed or inadequate public understanding of the princess's actual condition. Those concerns had been dismissed. The palace's position, communicated through William and backed by Charles's authority as king, was that the royal family's unique constitutional position justified a different standard of disclosure than would apply to private citizens. The monarchy's stability was a matter of national interest, they argued, and therefore managing public perception of Catherine's health was a legitimate exercise of institutional protection. The cover-up intensified when the biopsy results showed precancerous cells. That information reached William on January 21st, a Monday morning that he would later describe to a confidant as the worst day of his life. He had been at Kensington Palace reviewing plans for upcoming engagements when the call came through from Catherine's consultant. The news required immediate decisions about treatment protocol, but it also created a new crisis for the palace's communication strategy. If they disclosed cancer, even in precancerous or early-stage terms, it would dominate all royal coverage for months. Her illness would define Catherine, her children would face relentless media scrutiny, and William, as future king, would be judged on how he handled the situation, with every public appearance analyzed for signs of strain or distraction. The palace's media advisors argued that revealing cancer would make normal family life impossible and potentially compromise Catherine's ability to recover in peace. So they made a calculated decision: complete silence until treatment was well underway and they could control the narrative more effectively. Catherine began chemotherapy in late February, but the palace said nothing, maintaining the fiction that she was simply recovering from surgery and would return to duties after Easter. When that timeline proved impossible to maintain, they pushed it to early summer, then to Trooping the Color, always staying just ahead of the questions while revealing as little as possible. The March video announcement, when it finally came, had been the subject of intense debate. Some advisors had argued for continued silence, believing that disclosure would open doors to more questions and scrutiny. Others recognized that Catherine's absence was generating increasingly wild speculation and that some acknowledgement was necessary to stop rumors from spiraling completely out of control. What the public never knew was that the video had been filmed over 3 separate sessions because Catherine had struggled emotionally to get through it. The final version was assembled from the best takes, with careful editing to hide the tears and breaks that had occurred during filming. William had been present for every attempt, watching his wife try to project calm assurance about a situation that terrified her, and feeling the weight of the institutional pressure that demanded this performance. Charles's role throughout this period had been conflicted. As king, he understood the logic behind managed disclosure. As a father, he watched his daughter-in-law suffer while maintaining a fiction that pained him deeply. During a private conversation in late summer, Charles reportedly told an old friend that he felt complicit in a deception that might ultimately damage the institution more than truthful disclosure ever would. But by then, the cover-up had acquired its own momentum, and reversing course would require admitting months of dishonesty. Princess Anne, when she learned the whole truth about Catherine's condition and the palace's response, had been characteristically blunt in her assessment. She told Charles that lying to the public about a matter of this significance was indefensible, and that when the truth eventually emerged, as it always did, the damage to royal credibility would be catastrophic. Her prediction, made in August, had proven accurate less than 4 months later when the medical team broke their silence. The final element of the cover-up involved pressure on media outlets. Palace communications staff actively worked to discourage investigative reporting into Catherine's health, using a combination of access management, threats of legal action, and appeals to medical privacy. Several journalists who had begun pursuing the story more aggressively had found themselves cut off from royal sources, with their questions unanswered and their organizations warned that aggressive health reporting would damage their relationship with Kensington Palace. That pressure had worked mainly, at least until this afternoon. Why the medical team finally spoke out. The breaking point for Dr. Eleanor Ashworth came in early November, during a consultation that had nothing to do with Catherine, but everything to do with the ethical crisis she had been struggling with for months. Dr. Ashworth had felt something break inside her at that moment. The patient's hope was based on a narrative that wasn't true. Catherine hadn't recovered the way public statements suggested. Her treatment was ongoing, her prognosis remained uncertain, and the image of triumphant return to health was a carefully managed fiction. This patient and thousands like her were making medical decisions and forming expectations based on fundamentally false information. That evening, Dr. Ashworth had called Dr. James Whitmore, her colleague and friend, and told him they needed to talk. Over dinner at a quiet restaurant far from central London, she had laid out the ethical case for breaking the silence. Medical professionals had a duty that transcended patient confidentiality when deception reached a level that could harm public health understanding. Dr. Whitmore had been wrestling with similar concerns. He had watched the palace's managed communications with growing discomfort, recognizing that the gap between clinical reality and public statement had become a form of medical misinformation. The third doctor, Dr. Priya Mehta, had joined their discussions after Dr. Ashworth reached out in late November. Dr. Mehta had been part of Catherine's surgical team and had witnessed firsthand the complications that occurred during the initial emergency procedure. She had been present for subsequent admissions over the summer and knew that Catherine's situation was far from the resolved case the palace presented. The 3 doctors had spent weeks consulting with medical ethics specialists, legal advisors, and colleagues whose judgment they trusted. The question they needed to answer was whether their obligation to patient confidentiality even for someone as prominent as the Princess of Wales, outweighed their responsibility to correct dangerous public misrepresentation about medical realities. The turning point had come when they discovered that the palace had been using Catherine's supposed recovery as leverage in discussions about NHS funding and royal patronage of cancer charities. They had approached the General Medical Council, the body that regulates medical practice in the UK, with their concerns. The GMC's Ethics Committee, after reviewing the situation in detail, stated that, while not explicitly endorsing public disclosure, it acknowledged that exceptional circumstances involving significant public deception might justify a departure from usual confidentiality standards. The evidence they presented at the press conference was carefully prepared to support their claims without revealing information that could be considered a gratuitous privacy violation. They had timeline documents showing discrepancies between palace statements and actual medical events. One particularly explosive document, referenced but not fully disclosed at the press conference, was an email from a senior Kensington Palace communications advisor to the London Clinic's administration. The email, sent in mid-February, had stated bluntly, "Our messaging strategy requires that any public statements about HRH's condition emphasize routine recovery and avoid terminology that might generate alarm. We trust the medical team will support this approach in their interactions with external parties." The personal cost of going public was not lost on any of the three doctors, but all three had concluded that remaining silent was the greater ethical violation. As Dr. Ashworth had said during the press conference, "We took an oath to do no harm. Allowing harmful medical misinformation to persist when we have the power and knowledge to correct it violates that oath more seriously than any breach of confidentiality. Sometimes the greatest harm comes from silence, not disclosure." Catherine's real condition. Today, with the medical team's revelations now public, the question everyone was asking became unavoidable. What is Catherine's actual condition today, 11 months after her initial emergency? Catherine remains under active medical monitoring, with consultations occurring bi-weekly rather than the routine intervals that would apply to someone in genuine remission. These appointments, held privately at the London Clinic during times when the facility is cleared of other patients, involve comprehensive blood tests, imaging studies, and assessments by multiple specialists. The frequency and scope of this monitoring indicate ongoing concern about potential recurrence or progression of abnormalities that initial treatment didn't fully resolve. The follow-up scans conducted in July and again in October, neither of which was publicly acknowledged, had shown what medical professionals describe as findings requiring continued surveillance. That careful language obscures the reality that Catherine's medical team has detected persistent abnormalities in tissue that was supposed to have been addressed by the chemotherapy. These aren't necessarily active cancer cells, but they represent cellular changes that could progress into more serious conditions if not closely watched. During the press conference, Dr. Whitmore was asked directly whether Catherine was in remission. His response was telling. "The term remission has specific medical meanings that I cannot apply to this case without violating confidentiality more extensively than I'm willing to. What I can say is that Her Royal Highness continues to require specialized medical management, and that characterizations of her as having fully recovered or completed treatment are not accurate." Sources within Catherine's expanded care team have confirmed that she remains on a modified chemotherapy protocol, receiving low-dose treatment at monthly intervals designed to suppress any potential cellular activity without causing the severe side effects of full-strength chemotherapy. The physical toll has been significant and visible to anyone paying close attention. Catherine's public appearances since the summer, while carefully managed to project health and vigor, have shown subtle signs that trained medical observers immediately recognize. The palace's strategy for managing Catherine's public schedule has involved elaborate choreography designed to hide these limitations. She appears for brief periods at high-visibility events, her presence fulfilling symbolic needs while avoiding sustained engagement that might reveal her reduced capacity. Photographs are carefully selected to showcase her at her best. Video appearances are short and can be filmed over multiple takes, and any situation where her limitations might become obvious is simply avoided. But the psychological impact may be even more severe than the physical challenges, as multiple sources close to Catherine have described her state of mind as deeply troubled, caught between the reality of ongoing illness and the institutional pressure to perform wellness she doesn't feel. She has expressed to close friends a sense of betrayal by her own body, anger at the palace for forcing her into public roles before she felt ready, and resentment at the constant scrutiny that makes genuine privacy during health struggles impossible. The impact on her marriage has been significant. William, struggling with his own fear about Catherine's prognosis and guilt about the institutional pressures he helped create, has reportedly become more withdrawn and protective. Friends describe tension in the relationship, not because of any lack of love, but because Catherine feels William prioritizes institutional needs over well-being. At the same time, William believes he's made enormous personal sacrifices to protect her privacy and to give her recovery time. The children, George, Charlotte, and Louis, have been partially shielded from the whole reality of their mother's condition, but they've noticed changes that worry them. George, now 11 and increasingly aware of royal dynamics, has asked direct questions about why his mother seems so often tired and whether she's really better, as the palace keeps saying. Catherine and William have struggled to find age-appropriate explanations that are honest without being frightening. Perhaps most troubling are the whispered conversations among Catherine's medical team about long-term prognosis. While they maintain professional optimism in official consultations, private discussions acknowledge significant uncertainty about whether Catherine will ever return to full health or whether she'll manage a chronic condition for years or possibly decades. The type of cellular abnormalities she's experiencing can stabilize, but they can also progress unpredictably, and the medical literature offers no clear roadmap for her specific case. The question of future pregnancies, never publicly discussed but relevant to a woman of Catherine's age with 3 children, has been definitively answered by her medical situation. Her doctors have made clear that the treatments she's receiving and the ongoing monitoring she requires make pregnancy impossible and potentially dangerous. For a couple whose friends say they had discussed the possibility of a 4th child, that door is now permanently closed. The palace's continued insistence on projecting Catherine's wellness, even after this afternoon's revelations, stems from a calculation that admitting the whole reality would create untenable public pressure and speculation. If the Princess of Wales is acknowledged to have an ongoing serious medical condition with uncertain prognosis, every public appearance or absence will be analyzed for signs of deterioration. The children will face constant media speculation about their mother's health, and William will be judged as a future king, managing both institutional duties and family medical crisis simultaneously. But the cost of that continued deception, now exposed by the medical team's disclosures, may be even higher. Public trust, once broken on a matter as serious as health truthfulness, becomes nearly impossible to rebuild. And Catherine herself, trapped in the performance of wellness that doesn't match her lived reality, pays the heaviest price of all. She remains in the assessment of those who know her best, seriously ill, courageously fighting, and profoundly betrayed by the institution that claims to protect her, while forcing her to lie about the hardest thing she's ever faced. The palace's response, and what happens now. The emergency meeting at Kensington Palace began at 4:30, less than 3 hours after the doctor's press conference concluded. The initial legal assessment was devastating. While the doctors had likely violated patient confidentiality laws, any attempt to prosecute them would require the palace to confirm the very information they had been hiding. Taking legal action would require disclosure of Catherine's complete medical records in court, making everything public in the most damaging context possible. The communication strategy that emerged from that meeting was reactive and defensive, lacking the control that had characterized previous palace responses. A statement was drafted, revised 17 times, and finally released at 7:42 that evening. However, the statement satisfied no one. It didn't deny the doctor's specific claims. It didn't address the accusations of institutional pressure on medical staff. And it certainly didn't provide the transparency that the public was now demanding. Charles, informed of the developments while at Highgrove, had initially wanted to issue a more comprehensive response that acknowledged errors in judgment while defending the family's desire to protect Catherine's privacy. But his advisors had counseled against any admission of wrongdoing, arguing that it would open the palace to unlimited liability and criticism. The king had reluctantly agreed, though sources close to him indicated he was deeply troubled by the situation and worried about long-term damage to institutional credibility. By the following morning, the medical establishment had begun turning against the palace, threatening to make the crisis exponentially worse. The Royal College of Physicians issued a statement expressing concern about reported institutional pressure on medical professionals to misrepresent patient conditions. The political dimensions escalated quickly. Opposition leaders, sensing vulnerability, began asking pointed questions about whether the royal family considered itself above the ethical standards that bound ordinary citizens. Some MPs called for a parliamentary inquiry into palace influence over medical institutions, and a few, primarily from the Republican wing of politics, suggested that the incident demonstrated the fundamental problems with hereditary monarchy and its resistance to standard accountability mechanisms. For William personally, the crisis represented a devastating convergence of his deepest fears. His wife was seriously ill. That reality was now public knowledge, stripped of any protective privacy. His judgment in managing the situation was being questioned internationally, and his future credibility as king had been compromised by accusations of dishonesty on a matter where truthfulness should have been paramount. Associates described him as furious at the doctors for breaking confidentiality, but also quietly acknowledging that the palace's strategy had been unsustainable. By week's end, tentative plans were emerging for a more honest approach to discussing Catherine's health. Advisors suggested a personal statement from Catherine in video or written form that acknowledged ongoing treatment, thanked the public for its support, and requested privacy while being more truthful about the challenges she faced. As December progressed and the crisis showed no signs of subsiding, one truth had become inescapable. The doctors who broke the silence had achieved their goal. The truth was out. But the consequences of that truth, for Catherine, for William, for the monarchy itself, were only beginning to unfold, reshaping the institution's relationship with both medical privacy and public honesty for generations to come.